legislature to, sorry, okay, to look into why we have an ozone problem and what we need to understand about our resources, our capacities, to think through potential solutions for our ozone issue. And so through that committee, it began in August, we went all the way up through December. I think we really made the case that we have an ozone issue along the Front Range. It is formally documented by the federal government. We know this term, right? The non-attainment zone. And as much as people talked about what ozone is, no one actually denied where we're actually at in our compliance with the Clean Air Act and to say that we are in non-attainment. There was a lot of conversation about some of the root causes, everything from this is the amount of ozone we have to we can't really impact business to get it lower. But I'd like to say again that I feel like the committee certainly made the case that we have an issue in non-attainment. And until we take more directed actions, we are just not going to be able to move past our ozone issues. And so for those of you who are new to the concept as to why we probably have this problem that is unique to the Front Range, which is primarily where a non-attainment zone is, well, we are a state that has a huge oil basin. We moved maybe 2 million people in the last 15 years in front of the mountains, and the winds blow from east to west and hit a brick wall known as the Rockies. So our wind just hits and sits and stays. And so we are at a critical junction in our state to really think about how can we balance, or what is it that we prioritize? And I think myself and many other members on the committee, we believe we need to prioritize our public health. We need to prioritize the lives and safety primarily of our communities that are most impacted, not only deeply impacted, but disproportionately impacted. And as such, I think we're going to move forward in this upcoming session, which just began last week. We meet for 120 days until the first week of May with thinking through legislation on how we can support bringing down what we know to be true about who is and what is contributing to the ozone problem. And so we're looking at operations and permitting. So if an entity wants to operate in the Front Range, particularly in the non-attainment zone, we need to probably strengthen our permitting processes to figure out the information we need to know ahead of time before people are starting to dig for that oil and gas, on what the impact is going to be on our air before we allow them to operate. We're also looking at enforcement for those bad actors. We need to right size the market to where if you act incorrectly, you don't just pay the fine and move on. That is not an actual accountability system. So we need to adjust it to match what it is we want to hold people accountable to where it will be an actual deterrent. And then lastly, we are thinking about a lot of the other little things that we can figure out how to do or to create some controls around so as we don't ancillarily continue to contribute to our ozone problems. And so in our committee, we heard about a lot of things. We heard about non-converted motors. Everyone knows what a catalytic converter is now, right? We heard about lawn mowers. We heard about a few other things that we know attributes to the ozone problems that we have. And so we are looking forward to, in this upcoming session, to really pushing our neighbors to say, we are at a critical point in which we need to learn how to balance the public health and prioritize the public health of our communities with our growth and with our operation. And our systems need to adjust to act accordingly. Because again, that deep dive that we did over the last couple of months, we have found we're a little out of whack, if you will, out of balance in how we're operating now, which is contributing to our problem. So lastly, I'll say, every couple of years, we have to submit to the federal government, what are we going to do to bring our area right into attainment? And attainment kind of means what is theoretically tolerable for our bodies to kind of breathe in with ozone, which is such a like a scary question. But since we have been in non-compliance for going on 15 years now, we just kind of noted what we're putting on the table might be small and around the edges of what we need to solve, but it's really not getting us there. And so I think many of my colleagues are at a place where we just have to act swifter and, with a little bit more conviction to get us to where we need to be as a matter of our health. So I'm, again, very honored to be here. I'm honored to hear from our neighbors and our constituents on what this issue really means to them and how people have been so deeply impacted. I'm really honored to also elevate the voices of our neighbors and communities, as they are the ones that are driving this legislation for me, as someone who's just committed to be a steward for their voice here in the Capitol. And so I will pause there. I went very quickly trying to honor our time. You have a lot of experts on this panel with me today that over the last couple of years, they've been helping me learn, but they're here to answer questions as well as verify what we know to be true about our ozone issues. So I hope that was helpful, Emma and Lorena and Andrew and Renee and Luz. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Representative Bacon. And I want to give it the floor to the next panelist. So Lorena.
Thanks, Rep. Bacon and Emma. Emma, do you want to share my slides? You wouldn't mind?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
All right, well, I can start by introducing myself. Good evening, everybody. My name is Lorena Gonzalez. I am the Communities and Justice Campaign Manager with Conservation Colorado. And like Representative Bacon said, I've had the opportunity to work with this crew of folks to really dig into the problem of ozone. And so what we're going to do is take a little bit of a step back. We know that ozone is a really complex issue. So we want to start with a primer of what is ozone, and then get into some more specifics about like how bad is the problem in Colorado and where does it come from and what are the health and climate costs. So I'll be getting into that here next. So let's go ahead and begin. So what is ozone? Ozone is a main driver of what many know as smog or haze. And so to ground us in what we're here to discuss, I want to start by recognizing that there are two different types of ozone. And the graphic on the screen does a great job of distinguishing between the two, illustrating that ozone is good up high, but bad nearby. So high in the atmosphere, ozone acts as a protective layer that shields us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet rays. However, at ground level, where we breathe, ozone is a dangerous air pollutant with harmful effects on people and the environment. And so just to be really, really clear, we're not here today to discuss the ozone layer. The focus of tonight is bad ozone, which is in the lower zone. So how exactly is ozone created? It does form when nitrogen oxides, you'll hear us say NOx for short, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs for short, meet sunlight. And so these are two pollutants that come with a host of health concerns, and we'll get to that in a minute. And so you won't actually see or smell ozone itself, but if you are outside on a hot, sunny summer day in Colorado, you are likely breathing it. And for years, the summer ozone season came with ozone alert, high ozone alert days, warning the public that the air outside could be unsafe to breathe. Now, we did start to see the number of ozone alerts this summer go down, but it was due to sheer luck. So compared to years prior, we had more favorable weather by way of more rain and cloudy days, especially early in the season. And so we need to really understand that ozone levels are still in the severely unhealthy category. So seeing a decrease in the ozone alert days is good, but we do need to get to zero exceedances to adequately protect public health. And we can go on to the next slide, please, Emma. All right, so how bad is Colorado's ozone problem? Well, since 2008, Colorado's Front Range has consistently failed to meet the EPA's health-based ozone standards. In 2022, EPA downgraded the Denver Metro North Front Range area from a serious to a severe violator of federal ozone standards. That is the second to worst classification that you can have here. And this doesn't come without consequence. The downgrade does trigger tougher state air pollution permits, and requires gas stations to sell fuel that is cleaner burning and potentially, more costly during this year's summer ozone season. And so when Colorado fails to address ozone with the urgency it does deserve, we all pay the price. So we'll move on here to the next slide. So you might be wondering where ozone comes from. Well, in Colorado, ozone pollution is often blamed on out-of-state pollution or even wildfires. And we hear that much of the ozone problem is out of our control. And we do agree with that assertion. There is very little that we can do about, contributions that may be coming from California wildfires, for example. But let's reduce ozone from the sources in our state. That's what we do have control over, and that is what we're here to advocate for today. So let's turn our attention towards the pie charts that model the sources that contribute to our ozone problem. These numbers come from the state, from the RAC, the Regional Air Quality Council, in May of last year. And as a reminder, NOx does stand for nitrogen oxides, and VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. These are the two components that form ozone. And it's a bit tough to see the pie charts, so I'll break them out a little bit for y'all. So in gray is oil and gas. This includes area and point sources. These are things like just general operations, storage facilities, drilling. And then the yellow is on-road vehicles. So these are light, medium, heavy-duty vehicles like SUVs, pickup trucks. And orange is non-road sources. This could be construction operations or agriculture. Light blue is point sources, which are industrial sources or electricity generation. And then the darker blue, that is area. So those are personal care products or cleaning products, etc. So now that we've got that out of the way, I want to highlight a couple of important sources. So NOx levels from oil and gas, and again, that is the gray, were almost 31% in 2017. And if you look at the pie chart directly below it, in 2026, NOx levels are projected to grow to 47%. And looking at the NOx levels from the transportation sector, those were at 32% in 2017, and in 2026, that number will drop to 15%. So painting a clear picture here of the contribution from oil and gas. And when it comes to volatile organic compounds, those emissions from oil and gas were at 46% in 2017, and in 2026, oil and gas is projected to account for about 34% of VOCs. And so just underscoring here, the oil and gas sector will account for close to half of all ozone forming pollution. So that's 47% of nitrogen oxides and 34% of volatile organic compounds. So let's move on to the next slide, and we are happy to share this information after as well. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about some of the health and climate costs that come with our longstanding problem of ozone. One is that breathing ground level ozone causes both short and long-term symptoms. So this is anywhere from coughing or discomfort in the chest, shortness of breath. It could make asthma worse. It could even cause like a risk of stroke. And there was a report that came out recently last year that said, it could even cause depression. So it is far reaching from a health perspective. Second, I want to name that ozone particularly impacts communities of color and low-income populations. We know that residents of disproportionately impacted communities are more likely to work outdoors during high ozone times. So on high ozone alert days, these folks don't have the luxury of staying safe by, going inside. And while we just want to be clear that while the impacts are more acute for these populations, make no mistake that ozone impacts everyone. If you're a runner, if you're an outdoor enthusiast, you might find it more challenging than usual during the summer ozone season. If you're a parent, you might have to think twice before letting your kids play outside on a high ozone day. And so again, this doesn't just affect one group, it impacts all of us. The third point here is that ozone exacerbates climate change. So we know that climate change causes increasingly hot temperatures and drier weather, which means that there are more days when ozone can form and rise to unhealthy levels. And so while ozone itself does not cause climate change, we know that reducing the pollution that causes ozone also help reduce the pollution that causes climate change. So there is an intertwined relationship here that I wanted to highlight. And finally, you should know that Coloradans bear the cost of damages caused by the oil and gas industry. So according to the EPA's co-benefits risk assessment screening tool, it says that eliminating NOx and VOCs from the state's oil and gas production would alleviate more than $536 million of health impacts each year. And that includes 50 premature deaths, more than 600 asthma attacks, and more than 2,800 lost work days. Further, the total cost of all emissions created during drilling, production, and transmission of oil and gas in Colorado is 1.5 times greater than the revenue the state collects from the oil and gas industry. And then third here is that the oil and gas industry and its supporting industries make up just 1.8% of total wages in the state. And these, the last two bullet points are from our friends at Colorado Fiscal Institute. Again, happy to share sources after. So I hope that was helpful and provides a bit of a primer on what ozone is, how bad the problem is, and some of the impacts that we're all feeling today. And I'll pass it back over to Emma.
Cool, thank you, Lorena. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. And Andrew, go ahead and take it away. And I think you have your presentation with you, right?
Yes, and is this in slideshow mode for everybody?
Yes, it is.
Cool. Can you see my notes on this slide?
No, we can't.
Okay, that's a bummer because I can't either. So we'll just do our best. So my name is Andrew Forkas Goodmanson. I'm Senior Manager for State Policy at Earthworks. I've been working on Colorado air quality regulations for the last, actually, I don't even want to count. I think it'll just make me feel bad about myself. But for quite a while, I'm a lawyer, sort of, and a policy advocate. And I'm here today to talk about the policy problems that have led to the issues that Lorena was describing, and hopefully some of the policy solutions that we can offer. So Lorena shared a version of this slide, but I think it's worth hitting again. This is basically just, again, showing that oil and gas, while not the majority of the problem, is by far the largest single industrial source of the ozone precursors that cause ozone when mixed with sunlight. As I think it was Rick in the Q&A was mentioning, these are not, for the most part, measured numbers. They're a mix of measurements and models. So the state basically takes a whole bunch of reported numbers that aren't coming directly from monitoring stations in every case, but they add them all up and basically separate them out by source. But no one's like going around everywhere in the state putting monitors that measure specifically these categories and like reporting that back to the state. That's one of the problems that we're actually going to talk about, is the lack of monitoring. But the other, oh, and this one's actually really fun. Sorry, I forgot I had the slide because I can't see my notes. This is showing that this is a statewide issue. Somebody asked in the chat, how does this affect Pueblo? Well, Pueblo is not a huge oil and gas producing region. There is oil and gas in the Southwest. And if you take a peek at this slide, you'll see that both NOx and VOCs in almost every case have actually gone up in terms of emissions per well from 2021 to 2022. So we make some progress on some issues, but the way Colorado is dealing with the ozone pollution issue, especially as it relates to oil and gas, is clearly not cutting it. And I'm going to be going fairly quickly through some like fairly technical issues. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll work on answering them. But I only have 15 minutes and we got to get through a lot of stuff. So we're gonna boogie. So part of the problem is that Colorado is working from a place where we want to say yes to basically everything. And that includes everything from, you know, new microchip processing facilities to new oil and gas wells. Colorado for the longest time has been working in the mode of facilitating development rather than putting the health and safety of Colorado's residents first. And that has been that has manifested in basically two core problems. The first is that we don't seriously scrutinize new emission sources when we permit them. And we also have two different agencies doing two different parts of the permitting job, and they don't really talk to each other very often. And they sort of separate responsibility for the problem between them and then pass it back and forth like hot potato. And no one ever catches the potato, more facilities get built, and more pollution occurs. I think the best analogy that we've come up for this is basically, if you think about the non-attainment area as a bathtub, the fact that we're in non-attainment means that the bathtub is full. And the way Colorado currently does its permitting is it has just cranked the taps open and hoped for the best. And as the charts that Lorena showed and the charts that I showed briefly show, that strategy, shockingly, hasn't worked super great. So we are working on strategies to change the way Colorado permits, to turn down the faucets, to stop adding water to the bathtub, and to help bail out at least a little bit of the ozone that's already in the non-attainment area. I think I just mixed those metaphors pretty horribly, but hopefully that works. So on this slide, I'm pointing to my screen that you guys definitely can't see. You'll see down at the bottom a little chart that shows the total number of oil and gas construction permits and general permits that the Air Pollution Control Division has approved from 2019 through 2022 and 2015 through 2018. And those numbers are massive. It comes out to about 1,500 oil and gas construction permits per year. And before you ask, I didn't think they drilled 1,500 new oil wells in Colorado last year. You're right, they didn't. Colorado has a real problem with the fact that the Air Pollution Control Division, when it permits oil and gas facilities, breaks every single emission source on an oil and gas facility into its own individual permit. So if you have an oil well or an oil pad, that pad may have 15, 20, 30 wells on it. It may have 10, 20, 30 tanks on it. It may have a whole bunch of flares. It may have a whole bunch of compressors and all sorts of equipment, all of which can cause pollution, and all of those get broken into their own permit. And Colorado does this basically to avoid the necessary scrutiny on its permits. So when you break everything up, it looks a lot smaller, but collectively, oil and gas is a huge problem. We call this aggregation. Basically, the permits are not, or the pollution sources are not aggregated into one giant source. They're broken up into a ton of little sources so that the problem looks a lot smaller. The second problem is that Colorado doesn't actually model any of the oil and gas permits that it gets. So rather than taking a clear look at how much pollution a facility may add to the non-attainment area, the state basically just rubber stamps every application it gets, assuming that it's small, what we call minor source. And the problem is basically like I was saying in the previous slide, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these so-called minor sources that collectively add up to the majority, the largest source of ozone precursor emissions that we see in the non-attainment area. And so without modeling, the state is sort of left with no tool to closely analyze any of the emission sources. So that's problem 2. And problem 3 is that we silo permitting into 2 different agencies. The Air Pollution Control Division handles the air pollution side of things, and the ECMC, the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, handles the actual drilling. And I think, as we had a question in the Q&A box about a recently permitted facility outside of Aurora. That was an energy and carbon management drilling permit. The air permit for that will have to be issued by the Air Pollution Control Division. And unfortunately, the Air Pollution Control Division isn't really going to talk to the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And it lets this problem lets operators in the state, again, not really scrutinize what's actually on the facility when it comes to emissions. And so when you look at each facility as a small individual source of pollution, you get one of these tiny little red dots. But when you look at it in the aggregate, you get this giant, horrible blob. Every one of these red dots represents a single oil and gas well. And if you look up here, I think you guys can see my mouse. This is basically the non-attainment area. It unsurprisingly overlaps with the densest oil and gas development.
The end, so go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll go ahead and answer a few of them. But next we have the amazing Renée Chacon with us. And Renée, the floor is yours.
Clasocomatio meto, clasocomatia tatanati, clasocomatito nantinklali, clasocomatia boritos, yaboritas, and all the ones that came before and all the little ones to come. My name is Renée Miller Chacon. We live on the land of the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Lakota, the Inde, the Dene, and 48 tribes that still live and travel through this space. It honestly is important when we're talking about not just disproportionately impacted communities, but communities that have been on the front lines of these spaces for generations, have unfortunately had to deal with generations of environmental racism and what we now call cumulative impacts, and how we can truly look at it with equity analysis of cultural responsiveness and trauma sensitivity. Right now, I'm co-founder of Women from the Mountain, an indigenous nonprofit made for environmental justice, with my co-founder, Micaela Iron Shell Dominguez. This is a land acknowledgement, but I ask you to do more than just make land acknowledgements, make room. Truly understand where we need to relearn, where we're erasing communities, and where we can help represent communities by relinquishing privilege. If you want to learn what land you're on or what land you're from, Native Land, CA. Our nonprofit is specifically found as a 501c3c4, working with LGBTQ, women, Two-Spirit, children, youth, and community of all colors and backgrounds for environmental justice and understanding. As organizers, we need a form of cultural education to even understand disproportionately impacted communities. We also need to create enforceable protections and safety with the sensitivity of understanding cumulative impacts is an urgency now, because it has been for generations within our very blood and our DNA of environmental racism that has deteriorated the quality of life for several generations. Our goal is to empower our community's educational needs through transformative education. And I saw in the chat that if you're looking to bring youth and programming workshops of understanding ozone or cumulative impacts, please reach out to our organization to help support that. I was on the Environmental Justice Action Task Force with CDPHE, specifically with Co-Commissioner Beatriz Soto of Equity Analysis of Cumulative Impacts. We helped pass the EJ Act addressing environmental racism for the first time. And Micaela Iron Shell Dominguez is also on the Denver Environmental Justice Advisory Board for the first time ever, introducing Indigenous rights and Indigenous equity priorities into that. So I'm asking you to understand that ozone is an issue that we can't wait on anymore. My community is dying. Not only do we have Suncor, we have over 1,000 industries in Commerce City. And honestly, Commerce City has many different forms of cumulative impacts of benzene, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide. This is once used in gas chambers. So when we're asking for you to understand air quality, we're asking you to understand the cumulative impacts of air quality, and ozone is just the beginning. The persistent lack of enforcement and accountability has undermined communities for generations. We've had to pass the EJ Act because what is now called the ECMC used to be called the COGCC. They work in silos. They often don't correspond or even share information about what is a disproportionately impacted communities with the Air Quality Control Division. And it took an entire act just for our state and federal agencies to start realizing not only should you not live in silos, you need to understand the definition of a disproportionately impacted communities by the community self-determination, and you need to be able to apply that with equity analysis for our health and safety. Because for too long, our state and federal agencies have delayed taking action to reduce ozone pollution and protect our communities, all for industry's benefits. I have been told several times, well, it's for the economy. The economy is not for the sacrifice of our future generations. So recent community-led air quality monitoring conducted by our partners at Cultivando found elevated levels of dangerous air pollution in Commerce City compared to other areas in the state, including pollutants that create ozone, including radioactive pollutants. I'd imagine what they'd find in other monitoring, but we need more community monitors. So what does disproportionately impacted communities mean? Well, we didn't create ourselves. We didn't look into spaces that were going to be cumulative impact, not only in our air, land, and water, but our very workforce that has to deal in these spaces. And we didn't redline ourselves to low-income communities of only color facing disproportionately health impacts due to racist city planning, which places pollution sources like oil and gas operations, factories, and highways near these areas despite community protests. These communities are also more likely to have less access to quality health care. Often outdoor workers, a majority of who are people of color, also face higher risks, as was mentioned before, because they're unable to escape breathing in dangerous pollutions without risking their livelihoods. When you're talking about risking the economy, you're talking about risking every one of those workers' rights. So, health and safety risks. Breathing ozone triggers serious health problems, including asthma attack, decreased lung function, aggravated lung disease, low birth rates, and premature birth, among others. These are communities that often either didn't have access to healthcare, but now if they do have access to healthcare, are also treated in a very culturally insensitive way when they go to healthcare professionals. So how are we truly looking at this space with not only their healthcare, but their right to thrive? Ozone also drives hospital admissions and increased schools absences. I believe nationwide, 1 in 4 youth either have to miss because of ozone days being higher emissions. So children and I can also give you all of these slides and all of the cited information. Children and elderly are the most sensitive populations and the most vulnerable, particularly to high ozone, and it's because they stay at home. It often, we don't think about how we can protect our children and our elderly, and it's getting to the point that not only are education spaces being privatized, but there's becoming few and fewer spaces for these very communities to be even able to go to the regulatory spaces and testify or be able to bring in information that is not only just culturally sensitive, but doesn't become a barrier. So we're asking for addressing language barriers in these spaces as well, because we can learn a lot from the youth and the elders who have to deal with this every day. Ozone, most of all, exacerbates climate change and climate impacts. When I'm talking about climate impacts, I'm talking about the cumulative impacts. As we are already seeing, it has taken a long time just for it to snow, and we are not in healthy, attainable levels even for snow. So what does it mean? I asked that you reduce ozone benefits for everyone because it means reconnecting. My community legitimately sometimes can't even let our kids play outside during the summer ozone season, and all of our communities are connected. We want our communities to be able to live without the fear or worry of unhealthy air, or that they're going to need to have an inhaler just to be outside. I noticed that a lot of community members also have constantly cited they have to deal with air and land issues and water quality. So it's also understanding that it takes more money to be poor. Our communities not only have to deal with healthcare, they have to pay for their water in more ways than one. And they have to, in some ways, even pay for their air through their lack of healthcare access. So we're asking for communities that have privilege and are able to stand up and relinquish those privilege and platforms to be able to relearn that if Colorado's ever going to get in compliance with federal EPA ozone standards, it can no longer afford to streamline the construction of new emission sources and rubber stamp pollution increases in agency silos. The importance of this is, as Andrew mentioned before, that the bathwater is already overflowing. Well, the EPA has cited a state implementation plan for that bathwater 7 times. There has been what's called SIPs, which is a state implementation plan from the EPA to be able to come in attainable regulations. And unfortunately, it has violated that 7 times. It's unfortunate that it's having to take an 8th just to be able to understand that aggregation to permitting is an advance towards equity priorities for disproportionately impacted communities. And most of all, We do need to understand that pre-production oil and gas emissions are the primary driver of ozone problems. This isn't just oil and gas. This is many forms of extractive industries and the cumulative impacts of their byproducts that industries are not only monitoring and regulating themselves. We are realizing that our state and federal agencies for generations have not been for the interest of our public health and safety to the most vulnerable. I'm sorry if I had breezed through that quickly, and I'm more than welcome to, or I'm welcoming anyone that would like to ask any questions in the chat. But the one thing that I want to leave with you is my community right now is suffering this. It's unfortunate that community members, especially our youth, have to miss school just to be able to address their health, and they're having fewer and fewer forms of being able to have the access to health equity, and I haven't even talked about their mental health yet. So I'm asking as not just a councilwoman in the ward that I'm in, or as a mother in the space that I'm at, but someone that's willing to work with you, that if you want to educate your youth, if you want to educate your elders in a way that can re-empower them, learning more about policy and where you can get involved is just the beginning. I ask that you reach out to our organization if you're interested, and to every one of these awesome organizations that we work with, to be able to bring out the type of equity priorities for disproportionately impacted communities. The reason I ask this is because we've had to pass an entire Environmental Justice Act so that we can not only address disproportionately impacted communities or have best practices, but to, for the first time, be able to realize that the industries have been affecting all of our cumulative impacts of air, land, and water. And it's time for our communities to be able to have their health and safety enforceably protected. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you to all of our great panelists for that. I think Andrew, Lorena, it looks like you guys are answering some questions in the chat. Did anyone have any further questions? If you want to raise your hand, or I think we have a few minutes before our call to action, but yeah, Lorena, Andrew, Renee, any last minute thoughts or anything you'd like to say?
I think it's worth noting that we talked about a lot of potential legislation, and none of it's been introduced yet. So don't take any of this like to the bank yet. A lot of this is stuff that we're like actively working on. And there are a lot of concepts up in the air. A lot of people are asking questions in the Q&A box about like, how does this relate to this bill? How does this relate to that bill? And the answer for all of that for right now is it's super complicated and it's all up in the air. I think legislators are working on, I think the deadline for filing their first 3 bills is coming up at the end of the month. So we'll have a lot clearer picture at that point. But like all of this stuff is like important and we're working on it. So I don't want to like get anybody overly like excited about one idea or not that, you know, like may or may not make it through the process, because the legislature is a complicated beast. Sorry for that clarification if that just like hurt anybody's like optimism about this session, but there's a lot of exciting stuff like coming up, and like some of it's going to change between now and introduction and the end of session.
Cool, thank you, Angie. We did have one in the chat. How can we make a difference on better ozone regulation? Do we change the law, or is there a process that a grassroots member, can be a part of?
I think that's a great question. And I think Lorena and other folks that, you know, have worked for organizations that are engaged in the Colorado legislature will have like ways to action alerts for specific bills when they come out. If we get excited about them, we'll have ways to announce our support for those bills, to ask folks to show up at committee hearings. Representative Bacon can certainly speak to this better than I can, but it's always super valuable to hear from the most directly impacted folks when we're contemplating legislation. And legislators get yelled at a lot. So like nice notes are like super appreciated. I work with a lot of legislators, and every one of them has told me that like the thanks that they get are like really powerful and nice to hear. So if you hear an idea that you like, you know, I'm sure Rep Bacon would love to, you know, hear about that. But yeah, I think the best way is just to stay engaged with your local orgs and, you know, pay attention to what's available to you at the legislature and make your voice heard. Colorado does a really good job of allowing remote participation as well. So you don't even have to go to the Capitol. You can Zoom your way in.
Yeah, and I just want to put a finer point on that. You know, we are up against some really powerful forces. We might be outnumbered in terms of, you know, the money that we can bring to the cause, but we are not outnumbered when it comes to the power that we can bring as people. And so I just want to reiterate what Andrew said. The best way to really make a change here is by helping us pass legislation this year, having your voice heard. So that's, you know, following the different committee hearings, coming out to the Capitol or providing comment remotely, sharing your story of ozone, of air quality, why, you know, you want to have cleaner air. You don't want to worry about your children's health or your parents' health. And so, yes, I would say definitely stay tuned. It's going to be a very big fight, and it's gonna be an all hands on deck moment. So we certainly need you to win on this.
I wanted to just add, a lot of communities that have already been in this space are exhausted. They've come to these spaces so many times to testify. So if you are ready and would like to testify, it does start even local. If you want to be in local spaces with your city councils, if you want to be able to testify when we have action alerts too from other environmental justice coalitions, by all means, you don't have to be a nonprofit and you don't have to be just a community leader. It's incredibly important to know that community members hold just as much sway, and any way that we can support you, whether it's information or talking points. That's what I meant by education. It's a way that you can transformatively bring those technical details and with your community's cultural response or trauma, be able to voice it from your opinions too. And we would love to help in any type of workshops in that way as well.
Great. Well, there was a hand up in the chat. Celeste, you had a quick question?
I just wanted to point out that buildings are 1/5 of Colorado's air pollutant. That's what's responsible for 1/5 of Colorado's air pollutants. And so this communication between energy and air pollution is really important. And then also the intersections between BIPOC communities and renters. It all is really important on how they all intersect in this kind of self-perpetuating cycle. So I just wanted to make note of that.
Thank you, Celeste, for that. And then Guillermo, did you have your hand up as well?
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Okay. First, thank you for the presentations. I think that they were great in perspective to what needs to be done. Now, I'm 79 years old, okay, going this coming year. We've been promised all of this since I was about 6 years old. In perspective to being out in the fields, in perspective to not having, let's say, toilets and all that type of stuff. We were migrant workers from Texas. In perspective to, and all due respect, at this point, we have to start rethinking on the solutions that people have stated in the past. We have to force both sides of the parties, independent, and everyone that's concerned that's coming into the state now. We have 1.5 million last year, supposedly, in the data that we have. Let's look at where they're coming from. They have tripled the amount of wealth compared to Colorado. But they're moving to Colorado with all the ills that they bring with them. When we say educate, for all the wells that they have produced and some of them have not been tapped, the people always have to pay for it. If people want to dig, okay, to the earth, okay, and pollute it, going in and doing all sorts of things, from mining to everything that destroys, each one that becomes and receives funding for giving permission so that they can drill, the way they started in Commerce City, the way they started in Denver, the way they started, they have to pay, in perspective to the people that own those properties. They're making a profit and still doing it. But from Commerce City all the way to Greeley, Congressional 8, okay, the new Congressional 8, should be utilizing this as to providing the funds to get this done and not take no for an answer. Our kids, they are, in a sense, at a loss. If I can think of ways of getting it done, but we never have the time to really get it done, as far as speaking.
Hey, Guillermo, it is 7 p.m., so I'm gonna have to ask you to.
Okay, and that's what I was gonna say, okay? In perspective to that, we never get enough to get people to be able to be heard in the right portion. If you allow time for the presenters, then honor them to be able to understand as to where we're coming from. Some of the minority people, and that's statewide, okay? But look at where some of these people are coming from the north,
Thank
Cheyenne.
you,
all
Guillermo.
over.
We would love to hear your
Okay,
story more.
okay,
and
okay,
so-
okay. Thank you very much. But
Thank you.
again, thanks again.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I put in the chat a call to action to urge your legislatures to push for more restrictions with oil and gas. Again, thank you to our wonderful panelists for joining us tonight, and we will have a follow-up email with the recording, and you can find our recording on our Conservation Colorado YouTube channel. Thank you everyone, and then panelists, if you have any last words, if not, then thank you and have a great evening.
Have a gentle one. Grateful for you all.
Thank you, everyone.